Haha. All right. So hopefully this actually kind of shows up a little bit so y'all can see what I'm talking about now. So that should work. All right. So today we're going to go over the first part of Empires in Collision, your chapter 19. And then I'm also going to post some AP resources for the exam that I want you to start looking at and start figuring out. Okay. So today you're just going to answer the questions that I post in here, and that's really going to be about it. I'll post another video going over your rubric for the AP exam for essay writing, and I'm going to post something about a review sheet as well and kind of show you how to start filling that out. All right. So you'll have a couple, an overlapping assignment that'll go for the week as well. All right. So chapter 18 that we wrapped up with last week started talking about how imperial powers, so European imperial powers, were taking over Asia, right? I'm not Asia, Africa, all right, and parts of Asia. So we talked about how like Britain and France and Germany were going in and like basically chopping up Africa and giving it away when they didn't have the right to do that. Okay, and so today we're going to talk about how Asian powers like China, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan reacted to them trying to do this too. Okay, so during this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, we've got European powers like Britain going around being jerks. All right, for the nicest word possible, trying to take control of everything. All right, and they're not the only ones. There's other countries. Okay, but they're kind of the ones that your book uses as a big example. So we saw that whenever we talk about imperialism in Africa, like I mentioned, they just kind of went in and took over. All right. That doesn't necessarily happen in Asia with China and the Ottoman Empire because they were a little bit more well established, but things did kind of go downhill for them. All right. So what we'll look at first, today we'll look at China. Monday we'll look at the Ottoman Empire and Japan. Okay, along with a couple other things. So, China and imperialism. This picture right here, I'm going to kind of keep referring back to because it's the one that's in your book, and it does a pretty good idea of representing what was happening. All right, China, like the Ottoman Empire and Japan, was able to stay somewhat untouched by European imperialism, although they were brought into an ever-growing world trade network that would affect them later on. This, coupled with their own internal struggles, would set the stage for many conflicts to arise later on down the road. And that's kind of what this part of the chapter focuses on, is the conflict that comes up in China because of all this, right? So, we're going to take a while again today. It was working fine earlier. My internet was slow and I couldn't record anything, so I guess I got to give and take, all right? So this picture I'm going to refer back to constantly is the dividing of this carving out the spheres of China, which I'll come back to. All right. So you have to at first remember that China was a major power in Asia before this happened. All right. They were self-sufficient. They were able to do and grow their own food, make their own products. They didn't really need help from the outside. And then we're going to see a change. So in 1793, about 100-ish years before all this, all right, the Chinese emperor rejected the British king and British Empire from accessing Chinese ports and goods, stating they had an abundance of anything they needed and they did not need to import the manufactures of the barbarians. So 100 years before all of this that we're about to talk about, China, like I said, was like, no, we don't need your stuff. Stay out of here. We don't need you to buy our stuff. We don't need to buy yours. We're good. We're taking care of us. All right. You do you. We got us. We don't want you in here. Stay out. All right. And so that 1793 also just realized that that's right after the American Revolution. So the British king not only loses the colonies, now he's being told no by China too. All right. So kind of might start some bad blood. However, by 1912, China's imperial state had collapsed from within, and they now depended on a European and Britain-controlled global trade network. So remember, I said there's going to be a lot of internal conflicts, and that's what we read about. And they're going to, like it says, they're going to crumble from inside. All right. This picture I really, really like, and I put it on the next one. Political cartoon. If it changes, let's see. But I do kind of want you to look at that because it shows China. To me, oh, I went too far. To me, it shows China and it looks almost dragonesque to me, all right, which would appeal to the Oriental side of things. But also the great power that China had. But it also now looks weakened. It's chained, or not chained, sorry, that's the hair. But it's weakened on the ground and everybody else is around it, okay? All the other countries, you see Japan, you see Russia, you see the United States in the background. All the other countries are around it and they look like they're standing over it, all right? And so that kind of does a good job of showing what I think it represents, all right? What happened to cause all this, all right? It's really what happened, the same thing happened in China that happened all around the rest of the world, all right? China experienced a huge population growth after the introduction of easily grown food crops. A lot of those came from the Americas. And so they were able to produce more food, which means they can produce more food, which means that they can support a bigger population. We see that happen all the time. Once there's farming innovations and people can grow more food, you have a bigger population just because you can support it, all right? Now, this happened everywhere else too, all right? The Americas were able to grow more food, their population increased. Same thing happened in Europe, all right? Now, the big difference that happened, okay, is that in China, there was no industrial revolution and there was no continued agricultural revolution to support all those people. So what happens is, yeah, this is a really good start. We got a lot of food going. Yeah, population growth. People are coming, or people are being born. Population's growing. That's awesome. And then we can't sustain it. All right. And that's going to be the problem that causes China to start to have all these internal problems. All right. So that's your first question. All right. What was kind of the start of China's internal conflicts? And it's the big population growth with no industrialization and no agricultural industrialization either. All right. Or agricultural revolution. Sorry. So big population growth with no way to sustain it. All right. And that starts to cause problems. Excuse me. So this meant pressure on existing land, smaller farms for peasants, and unemployment, and then everything else that comes with it. So we don't have a way to keep rejuvenating our land. We don't have a way to find more land, to improve farming techniques, to grow more food. And so it starts to cause problems. China's already explored everywhere that they can. Remember, we talked about in class how they explored to the western part of Asia. They explored south. They explored north until they hit Russia. They've explored all their area. So they can't produce more farmland out of anywhere. So more pressure gets put on the land that they have, right, which was already stretched to the max. Peasants now get smaller farms because everybody's got to try to have something. And so people start to become unemployed, malnourished, lack of food, low wages, all this stuff starts to happen. All right. So that kind of goes along with your question. So we start to see all of these problems start that I will get to as soon as this slide changes. So hope everybody's enjoying the nicer weather that we have today, because yesterday kind of like rained all day. All right. With all of these problems that are going on, food, socially, agricultural wise, they also had a really big problem with the government structure and corruption. Now, when I say government structure, what I'm talking about is that the population grew so fast that the government couldn't keep up with all of its basic works. Tax collection, social welfare, flood control, public security. The population grew so fast that the government couldn't keep up. All right. And so you're going to run into problems. They can't control the floods of the river. They can't take care of people on social welfare. So people are falling down into, homelessness, hunger, all this stuff. They can't keep up with public security. So it becomes unsafe, or taking taxes. When I talk about corruption, government officials started to fall off the wagon and accepting bribes to turn the blind eye to things, abusing peasants to collect taxes. Not show itself not only in corrupt officials, but also in harsh treatment of peasants as well. Your book points out the fact of treating peasants horribly just to get taxes out of them. All right. So government became corrupt. They couldn't keep up with the population growth. And so all of this just kind of sets in motion this spinning wheel of death that's kind of destined to come off of its hinges at some point and just spiral downhill. And so whenever we see that happen, we start to see groups, individual groups of bandits, people kind of taking things in their own hands, start to pop up across China. They drew followers and support from the unhappiness of the peasants, obviously, because there's no food, unemployment, it's not safe. The government officials that are higher ups are corrupt. All right. So these bandit groups drew support from the unhappiness and the discontent of the peasants, and a growing opposition from the native Chinese people against the Qing dynasty because of its Manchu origins. So remember, Manchuria is a northern area of China that most native Chinese people do not consider to be part of China. All right. And so people did not like the Qing dynasty because that is where its leaders, that's where it historically came from. Right. So there was a growing opposition to the dynasty that was in charge, the rulers, as well as general unhappiness around everybody. It all boiled up to the Taiping Uprising, which was super destructive. I'm going to give you the definition of the Taiping Uprising here in a second, but it's important to point out that the Taiping Uprising destroyed large parts of China, both just environmentally, cities and towns, killed tons of people. The Taiping Uprising was not a good thing. Right? And so that was one of your vocabulary words. So when I ask for your reading questions, what is this? And if it's a vocabulary word, here's a hint. Pull the vocabulary definition out of the back of your book. All right. I'm doing that as an easy answer for you, but also to help you get that term and the information in your head. All right. So the Taiping Uprising was a massive, I don't know why that says massive, Chinese rebellion against the ruling Qing dynasty that devastated much of the country between 1850 and 1864, based on the teachings of Han Xiaoquan. And so, like I said, it was massive, destructive, super destructive, loosely kind of based on Christian ideals. But on the bottom of page 830, that actually tells you China's internal crisis culminated in the Taiping Uprising, which set much of the country aflame between 1850 and 64. This was different from most kinds of peasant upheaval. Its leaders largely rejected Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. Remember, those are the three kind of founding religions that we see in China. The founders of the Taiping Uprising rejected them all and kind of followed a Christian method, a unique form of Christianity. Their leader, Han Xiaoquan, proclaimed himself the younger brother of Jesus, sent to cleanse the world of demons and to establish the heavenly kingdom of great peace. All right. They called for the abolition of private property, radical redistribution of land, the end of prostitution and opium smoking, and the organization of society into sexually segregated military camps. All right. They denounced the Qing dynasty as foreigners, and actually kind of started developing plans to set China in motion for industrialization. So they had very different ways of looking at things, but they had a future that they wanted to see. Okay. So, not necessarily always a bad thing, but maybe not necessarily the best way of doing things. It did offer women some freedom. All right. Remember, we talked about at the beginning of the year, Chinese foot binding, which is where, you have your foot. And then as when you're young, they bind your toes so that then they start to fold under, and so that your foot is super tiny and you're basically like walking like that. All right. Remember, the toes were under it and everything. They tried to get rid of that, even reversing it in some areas. They tried to say that women should deserve equal shares of land. And so that was a good thing. The setting ideas and plans for China to become industrialized is a really good thing. All right. But unfortunately, it didn't work. The Taiping forces were able to take control of a decent area in China, and they made their capital at Nanjing, but it did not last. They were too divided amongst themselves. They couldn't come together to make cohesive decisions. And in the decision-making, and indecisiveness was their downfall. All right. Because they couldn't make decisions quick enough and couldn't come together as one, they ended up being overtaken by the Qing dynasty and its forces. Okay. The Qing dynasty got support from Western military powers, and also from the local governing lords and their armies. So it wasn't the Qing dynasty, it wasn't the Qing dynasty's army that overtook the Taiping forces, it was the individual lords of the province's armies that defeated them. Okay, so that's an important thing to look at. Whenever we talk about why it was smashed, it wasn't the Qing dynasty itself, it was all these other people that did it. And the people of China realize that, and that's kind of going to play in their downfall later. Okay, and we'll talk about that here in a second. China's changing position in the global network became evident. Let me make sure. Okay. To everybody. All right. I told you that the local governors and warlords were the ones that defeated the Taiping uprising. They started to realize that, and the Qing dynasty lost a lot of favor and power. Right? And that's going to come back to play later. So whenever we see, we've already got these internal conflicts happening in China. And we know that the Western European powers really want in, and they really want to see some stuff happen because they've been kicked out for so long. This is when we start to see interactions start to happen that are not so good for the Chinese side of things. So China's changing position in the global network became evident in the Opium Wars. Right? These were two wars fought between Western powers and China after China tried to restrict the importation of foreign goods, especially opium. China lost both wars and was forced to make major concessions. We call them the Opium Wars. It's one of your vocabulary words. Opium caused many problems for China, from addiction to corruption. It's one of your vocabulary words, so we're going to talk about it for a second. So opium, if you've heard today when people talk about opiates, all right, it's derived from that. The Opium Wars, opium was a very addictive, easily addictive drug that people grew and would sell into China, where it became super popular among everybody. Your book says, where is it? Men and women, court officials, students preparing for exams, soldiers going into combat, and common laborers seeking to overcome the pain and drudgery of their work. All right. So it was becoming this really, really bad drug problem in China, and they decided to try to fight back against it and limit it coming in and tell them no, start limiting everything that's going on. And this is where we start to see it not work in their favor. So Britain was using opium to make up for the stuff that they were losing money on. And then it became a problem because they decided to basically outlaw opium coming into China, and this is where we see Britain get mad. So your book up names the commissioner Lin Zexu, who actually led the campaign against opium use. And so he was kind of the one that, like, the Chinese government decided to go against the use of opium. He's the one that spearheaded the whole thing, nicknamed the drug czar. And so, but the British got super offended because their property was seized, and they were limited on what they could sell and started hurting them financially. And so Britain's kind of got this big, well, we're an industrialized nation and we're taking over Africa. How dare you tell us we can't do that? And so now they're going to come basically bully China into getting what they want. And we see that happen with the unequal treaties. All right. So China tried to fight growing problems, limiting trade with European powers. Didn't work too well. Britain showed up with force, and they said they were going to teach China how to work with a global trade network and to work with trade in the proper way to engage in free trade and conduct with foreign countries. The proper way. They showed up with force to basically bully them into doing what they wanted. All right. So remember, this is a time when Europe, the European countries, Britain, France, all this stuff, are emboldened and very full of themselves, very self-confident from the industrialization that they created. And so they're kind of just going around and taking what they want. All right. And this happened with China. So this led to the unequal treaties that you read about in your book. It was a vocabulary word, and it's a series of 19th century treaties in which China made major concessions to Western powers. Concessions means that they kind of gave in, all right, or had to give something to those Western powers. The biggest things that ended up happening, let's see, I can't remember if it's on the next slide, but it's in your book. Let's see if it pops up. But the biggest things that ended up happening was that they actually had like people, foreigners were allowed to travel into China now, which hadn't been allowed before, travel freely. They were allowed to buy land in China. They were allowed to preach Christianity under the protection of Chinese authority, and like allowed to start like traveling through the country and doing whatever. So with that, the Chinese also could no longer refer to the British as barbarians in documents. So remember earlier, the Chinese emperor referred to them as barbarians and barbarian products, and now they can't even do that anymore. Once this happens, there's a second Opium War again with Britain, and which led to even more ports being opened in China. I think your book said 5, maybe. And so now China's just, once that happens and that second Opium War, and there's several other things, later defeats led to the loss of Vietnam, Korea, and Taiwan. And that phrase, carved up like a melon, it goes back to that first picture, the picture that's at the beginning of your, right there, beginning of your chapter that I put up there. So it very much, once they lost, they had these internal conflicts that can cause them to become extremely weakened. And then they started losing when they were trying to fend off all these European powers. It started happening just like it did in Africa. Each European country started digging into it and getting special circumstances. Right? They were allowed to trade in there. They had more ports open. They were then allowed to buy land. They were then allowed to do all these other things. And so we start to see these European imperial powers take and kind of carve their own place into China. Right? They didn't control it. Right? That's a big difference whenever we talk about colonialism and imperialism in Africa and some parts of Asia. Remember, this is where Britain basically came in and took control of Africa, a part of Africa, and said, this is mine. Italy took a part of Africa and said, this is mine. Remember, I gave you that instance where the European powers met, they peacefully negotiated and carved up Africa to each one of them, and then went in and took it by force and owned it and controlled it. They did not control China. All right. They just came in and got special privileges in that country. All right. Kind of like just like sinking their teeth into it and grabbing hold. All right. So that they were able to use it for their best interest. And so that's where we get the term that they were kind of part of this and created, or China became part of this informal empire, which is basically, it's still its own country, but it's now in an area in something else dominated by everyone else, right? It's in an area dominated by Western powers, but retaining its own government and a measure of independence, okay? So not controlled by a European power, but still in an area where European powers are predominant, all right? All of this was happening. It was not good. Chinese authorities and higher-ups were trying to address it, all right? And they tried to address it through a process of self-strengthening, the self-strengthening movement. And this was China's program of internal reform in the 1860s and 1870s, based on vigorous application of traditional principles and limited borrowing from the West. All right, so they're trying to keep themselves from relying on Western powers. All right, so limited borrowing from the West and try to focus on traditional principles and themselves. It was trying to also improve like the nation's military. It was trying to move forward, all right, with these industrial plans. And it says, I've mentioned that on page 837, let's see, an overhauled examination system designed to recruit qualified candidates for official positions sought the good men who could cope with massive reconstruction that China faced in the wake of the Taiping Rebellion. Support for landlords and the repair of dikes and irrigation helped restore rural and social economic order. Industrial factories producing textiles and steels were established. Coal mines were expanded, and a telegraph system was initiated. Chinese weapons are far inferior to those of foreign countries. A number of modern arsenals, shipyards, and foreign language schools sought to remedy this deficiency. However, it didn't work. All right. So it kind of all comes together with two things that end up happening. We see another defeat of China. So just remember that they've lost to Britain twice. They've lost to France. They're going to lose to Japan. So after that loss to Japan, we see another movement. So remember, we had the Taiping Uprising. Now we have another movement called the Boxer Rebellion, the Boxer Uprising, that happens in 1898 to 1901. That kind of just solidifies that it didn't work, right? And that they are still going downhill. Excuse me. The failure of self-strengthening reforms and then a defeat by Japan in 1895 led to an anti-foreign movement known as the Boxer Uprising. All right. The Boxer Uprising, which is one of your vocabulary words, is an anti-foreign movement led by Chinese militia organizations in which large numbers of Europeans and Chinese Christians were killed. It resulted in military intervention by Western powers and the imposition of a huge payment as punishment. All right. So whenever that happened, all right, China itself, the Qing dynasty, couldn't stop it. And so they had to have help from Japan and Western powers. And so when they did that, Japan and the Western powers forced China to pay them for doing that. And all of this happening, all right, the self-strengthening didn't work. Other people are having to fight the battles. The Boxer Uprising is tearing everything apart. Everything's kind of already been going downhill. And so many people start to blame the Qing dynasty. All right, well, they're the ones in control and power, and they're not doing anything to stop it, right? So we kind of see this start to happen. And people begin to form their own organizations dedicated to helping the future of China. All right. And so those organizations have some pretty cool names, and they're all like, they make sense. So we got, let's see, where was it? We've got the National Rejuvenation Study Society, the Society to Protect the Nation, and Understand the National Shame Society. All right. So all those names kind of go hand in hand with like, we got to fix this. Something's going on. All right. Let's see. That is that. Sorry, I got an email and got distracted. So all of this led to a newly formed Chinese nationalism that was directed against Western imperial powers, the foreign Qing dynasty, and aspects of traditional Chinese culture. All right, so all of this starts to go downhill, and then these new groups start to form to try to like boost China's nationalism and image. And then we finally start to see this idea of nationalism. Remember, we talked about nationalism before. It's an intense pride in one's country. And so we finally start to see this Chinese nationalism form. And people start to get really passionate about bringing their country into the new era, into the new age. The Qing dynasty tries to address this. They're like, oh, hey, man, everybody wants to see change. We're realizing all these problems that we've made. And they try to introduce reform. It was called the 100 Days of Reform that they tried to introduce, but it was too late. They waited too long. All right. And so everything just kind of, they tried all this stuff and then just kind of crumbled. All right. And what it actually ended up kind of culminating into is the Chinese Revolution of 1911, 1912, which is where we see the end of imperial order. All right. So we see the end of imperial order. All right. With the Chinese Revolution. So Chinese Revolution, another one of your vocabulary words, the collapse of China's imperial order officially at the hands of organized revolutionaries, but for the most part, under the weight of the troubles that had overwhelmed the imperial government for the previous century. So again, your book, I think, even says like a nudge from the revolutionaries. And it might have been, you've got these radical people that are wanting to see change and wanting to see stuff happen. But it was really all of this stuff that I just talked about was all just piling up. All right. And so eventually it just toppled over. And then we see the revolution of 1911 and 1912. And then that's kind of, the ending of an era and the beginning of a struggle for them to figure out what China is to reestablish itself and move on. Let's see. In 1912, the last Chinese emperor abdicated as the ancient imperial order that had governed China for 2 millennia collapsed, with only a modest nudge from organized revolutionaries. All right. So remember this idea of the emperor, the dynasty, all this stuff that has made China has been China. Like it's been what China is, gone. All right. And now we see something else. All right. And they have to be able to reestablish what they are now and what they are going to be going forward. All right. So your question for that whole thing that I just went on today, how is China's revolution, all right, how is the Chinese Revolution of 1911 and 1912 similar and different from other revolutions that we've learned about so far? All right. So you can pull from Latin American revolutions, French Revolution, American Revolution. How is Russian Revolution, right? How is the Chinese Revolution similar and different to revolutions that we've learned about so far? All right. That's your question. Submit that and make sure you get caught up on your work. I'm going to post some AP stuff for y'all to start looking at today. That's why this video is a little short. Monday, I'll go through your other section talking about the Ottoman Empire in Japan. Tuesday, we'll do some reading. Wednesday will be the last thing that you get to hear from me lecture-wise video. And then we're going to start working on some DBQs. All right. So I'll post some stuff for AP. Y'all get this done, submit those questions, and I hope you have a good long weekend. Get caught up on everything. Get those COVID journals done. All right. Please write them in, mail them in. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from everybody. Y'all have a good weekend. All right. Bye.